And hello, everyone, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King, and we are continuing our episodes today on science and spirituality. And today we're going to talk specifically about sacred geometry. Sacred geometry. Wow, quite a subject. I'll get into that in a second, but I did want you to know that I'm going to take the material today, give some examples of the sacred geometry, and then next week, I'm going to go back through this whole discussion of science and spirituality, and I'm going to talk about it in terms of the future of faith. And I'm going to propose and make the case for an integral approach, an integral theology, as that which will set us on a convergent source with science, that which will be required to go beyond religion, Christianity, etc., into a trans-religious, post-Christian approach. And so I'll make my case for that in the next episode that will conclude this science and spirituality, which, by the way, I've had a few email discussions with people that, in fact, what I'm trying to do, as opposed to taking science and proving that my religion is the correct religion, I'm looking at trajectories. And so when I talk next week about the future of faith, it will be my understanding of where science is headed and where spirituality is headed and where theology is headed if one takes the integral approach to it. So I'm not trying to use science here to prove that there's a particularistic group of us that are okay, that are accepted, that have the right religion. I'm not using it for that at all. And I want to get into that a little bit more next week. But today we're going to talk sacred geometry, and that goes back to some of the earliest empires in history. Some of the earliest empires and their sacred teachers have noted that there are geometrical patterns in the stars, there are geometrical patterns in nature, and these have become for them symbols of something greater that's behind the physiosphere or the biosphere, something greater that has manifested, in fact, through the use of these patterns. So next week, I'll talk a little bit about the nature of God and an integral approach to God from the standpoint of a self-organizing God, just as the universe and nature is and has been self-organizing. In fact, if you were to look back even 4 centuries or so before Christ came on the scene, Plato had quite a bit to say about sacred geometry, and Plato saw behind all things something that was manifesting in patterns that showed up time and time again. And then even down to the time of Jesus and beyond, we will find this sacred geometry appearing in most all world religions. They are doing that. Now I'm going to take a couple of them today because I'm trying to use science and spirituality to just kind of dip our toe in the water. This is by no means any kind of exhaustive study, but it is to say that, look, if we're talking about an integral theology, then there shouldn't be anything that we say, well, that field of study or this field of study doesn't apply to integral. If that's the case, then it's not integral. Integral means that there's an interconnectivity of everything that we understand within existence. So as we look at these shapes, I'm going to bring a couple of geometric shapes up here and share these with you. Let me pull up my slides, and we'll take a look at the first couple here. So here's a couple. On the left is the Nautilus. The Nautilus has long been seen for its growth in a efficient, energy efficient manner something that points to the way that nature works. I mean, if you look at the growth of vines, or you look at something that flowers, if you look at the galaxies in the Hubble pictures of the galaxies, you see this swirling circular kind of motion. And you may see some similarities to something else that I've talked quite a bit about here in our integral approach, and that's the spiral dynamics model, the spiral dynamics model. Spiral dynamics is based on this idea of the Nautilus. Why is that? Well, you can see at the center of the Nautilus, as it starts to grow, it is smaller in nature, and its growth continues on and on with interconnected layers, just like in the spiral. And that's why the spiral says that it is the evolution of spiritual consciousness or human consciousness is a transcend and include approach. So transcend and include would be modeled, for example, by this Nautilus. As you can see, each layer is dependent upon the previous. Also, you can see that it grows larger and larger with each layer that's added. And this is the same when you look at the spiral model. It goes outward. As it's circling, it's getting bigger and bigger, which is showing that we are a lot more inclusive in our consciousness today than in the earliest days of human beings. So the Nautilus would be one such geometric shape. And I brought it up because it is a symbol for spiral dynamics. One of the symbols, though, that's used in Joe Mastroleo's book, Ambient Christ, for those of you that have the book, you might want to read the chapter where he talks about sacred geometry, because he pulls some really cool stuff in. That's why I pulled this out of Joe's book. It's got some really great stuff in there on sacred geometry. And when we're looking at science and spirituality, these shapes and these geometric patterns truly are indicative of something behind them. Now, what's the shape that I have up here in the upper right of the screen? Well, there are two terms for it. One term for this almond shape is mandorla. Mandorla, it's an Italian term, and it literally means sacred almond. Literally means sacred almond. And the mandorla shape is a shape that's found in a lot of art. So for example, you would see in the Middle Ages, whenever there's a painting of Jesus or a saint, you see this aura around them. This is that mandorla or sacred geometric shape. Some people have said or speculated that it is because almonds were common throughout the Mediterranean and the earlier in places where you'd find the earlier empires, and they saw in this shape a lot of different things. For example, one of the things we'll talk about is that they also saw within this shape the shape of a womb. And so we'll talk about that, this being the sacred almond, the shape of a womb. But one other thing, and again pointed out by Joe in his book, is the term vesica. Vesica is a Latin term that literally means bladder of the fish. And we'll get to the fish here and its sacred symbol and geometric figure in just a minute. But vesica is Latin. It means, again, bladder of the fish. And we're going to look at some architecture, some sacred religious architecture based on this principle of vesica and or mandorla. The vesica was thought to be the gateway between orders of being, or a vesica was a doorway between worlds. And so we're going to, look a little bit closer at that as we proceed here with our diagrams and our models. So there is this shape, and I want to just focus on this particular shape for just a few minutes here in this episode. So let's take a look at what does it look like. What does vesica look like if we take this shape and we go? Again, if you look at medieval architecture and medieval art, this vesica shape is found throughout that period of time, and we're very familiar with it. And again, it's because it had a sacred geometry, if you will, associated with it. And you can see that you have this concept of a doorway, you have this concept of a gateway. So vesica is a transformative word. It is a gateway from one place into another place. So we have this almond shape. This is a shape that indicates that it is connecting so that one can have a gateway or doorway from something to something. And in fact, even in the definition of vesica as bladder of the fish, it was thought that this shape was again very common to the people in the ancient cities because many of them were established by and alongside a sea and a seashore. Even when Jesus appears on the scene, he's calling fishermen to come after him, or he's teaching perhaps, or out on a boat perhaps, telling a parable on the sea. And so the people would have seen, and this idea of vesica or bladder of the fish would have become something well known back before the time of Jesus himself. So where would we expect to see this idea of the bladder of the fish, or the Pisces, if you will, that we're familiar with? And that, of course, is going to take us to what we know as Ichiothus. For those of you that are not interested in taking Greek, I have. So let me just say that this is the Greek word Ichiothus, which means fish. And what was it? The Ichiothus, or fish, was this almond shape. It was the vesica shape, and it was taken by the early Christian community as a symbol of those who were followers of Jesus. And so they, interestingly enough, chose this particular symbol or geometrical shape for their identity, which this would really be followers, body of Christ, etc., in that first century time frame. So you have Ichiothus. Now, I've done a number of presentations, number of podcasts showing my trajectory of form to formlessness. And I now want to pull together this sacred geometry, if you will, to our integral approach. And I then want to contrast it to a religious attempt to use these symbols as they have their transformative meaning. So what am I talking about? Well, here we see the symbols right here in front of us. Where do we find that symbol? Oh my, look, there he is. There's the symbol, the Ichiothus. And where is Ichiothus? It's in the middle of that blasted Venn diagram he keeps putting up. It just seems like no matter where we go, we can't get away from this Venn diagram, can we? And I think that's because while it is on the one hand simple, it is also very elegant, and it allows one to dig into deeper and deeper and deeper levels of understanding with regard to integral consciousness and integral spirituality. So let's just talk a little bit about this Ichiothus appearing right here in the Venn diagram. First of all, what have we said all along? We've said all along that Christology is made up of two aspects. One is the individual Christ, which is at the left-hand side of this symbol, meaning at the very beginning of it, Jesus is the foundation stone of Christology. But the Pisces or Ichiothus symbol included all followers of Christ. So Christology is both the individual and the collective, and the individual and the collective are both represented here in the center of the Venn diagram. Now, from the standpoint of Vesica or Mandurala being a doorway or a gateway between two worlds, well, here we have an integral approach to our cosmology. I'm going to conclude in a few minutes by showing you my diagram of why this will not work, cannot work, as we move forward in the future of faith with regard to the interpretation of Christology as a religion. But it works beautifully when we see Christology not as a religious form to displace and replace the previous form. Rather, it is transformed in the sense that it is a gateway moving humanity from an understanding of their God identity through form attachment, which in the future of faith, I'll talk a little bit more about that, into a formless realm where we realize that the cosmology of that which brings true identity is a universal cosmology. We cannot separate, denominate, and segregate spirit, ground of being. It is one. And this is the conversation today. Unity consciousness, non-duality. It's the conversation because humanity is hungering and thirsting after the next step, the next better step, if you will. So looking at the center, we have a mandorla or a vesica. And notice that in my Venn diagram, I'm using, as in nature, circles, spirals. As a matter of fact, we could turn this Venn diagram and look at it vertically, and it'd be a spiral. And we would see that the bottom spiral is that form, and it goes up to the next spiral, and the next spiral up would be formless. And the way you get there is through transform. So transform has a specific purpose and a specific time. I think it's also interesting that if we were to pull up a diagram of the temple, we would see that the temple more is squared off or in rectangles and squares, and that doesn't have the same organic fruit of the spirit, if you will, manifestation. It's not organic. What do we have with the temple? What we have there is the earliest understanding of God identity. What happened to transcend that was the revelation of the prophets and then, of course, the apostolic writings that nevertheless, God does not dwell in buildings made with hands. So it is not the natural circular spiral, galaxies, vines, flowers that we see that relates to the universal spirit behind it all. Rather, the temple and its squared off building is representative of that which is made with human hands, which once again takes us to the point that identity is not about doing, which comes through the realm of form and attaching to one of the thousands that are out there, but rather identity is to be found after a transformative experience by which we detach or die to form, and we realize that our identity has always been and always will be resting in that which is behind all things and that which is universal. So it's formlessness that comes through spirit, not through that which is form. I could also have used here Paul and his two worlds, his two realms, his two mountains. We've been through this many, many times. But the point is that this vesica shape, this Mandurala shape, this shape which is sacred geometry that goes all the way back into the most ancient of empires is a shape, if you will, that applies beautifully to this integral approach. If I also look at this as a womb, let's look at the center here. Notice that we could say this is reflective of a womb. All right. What would there be in the biblical narrative that would point to this transformative work of Christology in the sense of womb? If you take a look at Matthew 24, Jesus describes this period of time right here in this mandorla, in this vesica, because this is this shape that we see, this Ichiothus shape, is from the cross to the fall of the temple. It's about a 40-year period. It's the last days of form, and it's the first days and beginning of that which is formless. And so you have here a womb, and in that time, Jesus outlines very clearly, not just Matthew 24. Those of you who have followed presence for years, you know this very well. Mark 13, Luke 21, the majority of the eschatological sayings of Jesus all center in this movement from one Jerusalem to another. And he says specifically that this time period, this 40-year time period, is going to be a time of birth pains. These are the days of birth pains. Jesus was saying, this is the time in history that something's being birthed. And our proposal on Integral is that we have not had a pregnancy for 2,000 years awaiting birth. That in fact, that birth was going to happen, as Jesus specifically said in every single one of his eschatological teachings, in that generation, before some of them standing there would taste of death, etc. So if we're looking at womb, Jesus certainly saw that period of time, that Ichiothus transformative period, as being a time of birth pains. Paul, of course, who reveals more about Jesus, if you will, in his ministry, and takes that Jesus expansion in a Nautilus form to even include Gentiles. Paul writes to the people in Rome, and in chapter 8, he says, the earnest expectation of the creation they were currently in, waiting for the one to come, that creation was waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. And he says, the creation itself will be delivered from bondage, that's the left-hand circle, attachment to form, constant loops, dysfunctional loops from which one cannot escape. Sin and death is always the result. And Paul says, because we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pains. That whole creation was grown. So we have birth pains once again, not just from Jesus, but also from Paul. And that shape, that geometric shape of the womb, the sacred almond, the vesica, the mandorla, was in fact for both Jesus and Paul a transformative period of time, not a form, but a transformative period of time. A birthing is a transformative process that is supposed to deliver something. And we have already been delivered into this cosmology that transcends time, space, and all other forms. And I may talk about that briefly, but when we look at quantum physics, we already know that theories that have been proven, such as in quantum mechanics, the principle of non-locality, that has shown us that that in fact is transcendent of time and space. So now we're beginning to see a real convergence if we're talking spirituality and not religion. Now, what would a diagram look like, or what do I see as the diagram of religion versus this? Here's one integral approach, and this is the way I diagram, and I have outlined that integral approach and the way Vesica and Mandurala works, how would I then describe the current situation today, even all the way up to postmodern views of Christianity? And so I did a little diagram here, and I've labeled it coexist. And I've talked about this many times before, and that is the bumper sticker that probably most of you have seen on the back of cars, where you have both Star of David and the cross, you have other world religions. And in postmodernity, the attempt is to do just that, to coexist. But there is no coexistence in non-duality. Coexistence requires two. Non-duality is defined as that which is not two. So coexistence would work real well if we were dealing purely with forms. So let's look at what we have. Today we have Judaism and we have Christianity. We have two world religions. One, of course, is after Moses, the prophets, David, etc. And then you have the cross. And after the cross, we have what became, as Christology interpreted, as a new form to displace the previous form. And so this is why, if you look to the right of the cross in the diagram that I have, you see all those little shaded in gray squares. That's just my way of putting some symbols up there to symbolize various denominations. Now, if I was going to be accurate, I'd have to put 20 or 30,000 squares up there, but Danae didn't have time. She did the charts for me, and she's, you know how she is. She just didn't even take the time to do it. So she did this many. I could also say that there are other boxes that I could add on here that I would say coexist with the box called Christianity. I could have, out to the right of this diagram, out from the Christian box, I could have put a Buddhist box, a Hindu box, et cetera, and other world religious boxes. And that, again, is in the shape of a square for me, because all of these require self as source. You decide which denomination to belong to and which religion to belong to, and so on and so forth. So religion, if you notice the way it is, the biblical narrative is interpreted today, the hermeneutic in first tier is that there are two world religions. That's a first tier hermeneutic of Christology, that it comes to bring a new religion. Notice that the Vesica or Mandurala goes away. It's not in the shape of the Ichiothus anymore, because these are not transformative into a new heaven and earth, a universal cosmology, a universal God identity. Rather, they're competing forms claiming that within their walls, God identity is to be found. And that is also why I use these squares to show that this idea of transformation goes away. There is no Vesica, and we can't say that there's a body of Christ like there was in the first century, when Paul said, at this time, there's one body, one faith, one God, one Lord, one baptism, one hope. But we can't say that when we extend it through history. Now there are many competing forms. And I have had more conversations with people over the last 5 years who have run into heartbreaking situations because these forms will always continue to divide. It is the nature of form, especially when self is the source and human beings decide who's in this box and who's not in this box, and whether we should once again divide, denominate, and separate and form more boxes. So as I look at the diagrams, and as I thought about the specifics of Ichiothus, and as I looked at these ways of interpreting or hermeneutics, next week in Future Faith, I'm going to get a little bit more into the fact that right here in Coexist, this is one hermeneutic. This is a completely different hermeneutic. There are two different hermeneutics. And what I'm going to talk about next week in the future of faith is what we can expect for the rest of this century and beyond. I don't know. I won't be around for maybe at best close to half of this century, depends. But the point is that a conversation has begun and we're all part of it. And I've had a lot of experience in this conversation. So I want to share with you from my experiences what I have come to understand and what we can expect. The good news is that because we're all in the hands of a God who is the source, and we're not in the hands of human beings, so that they at their discretion can decide what our identity is, or if we have the appropriate identity, or if we are accepted of God, or to be rejected. The great news is that all of humanity right now is exactly where it's supposed to be. It's on the Nautilus growth. It's just in one of those rings like we saw in the Nautilus picture. And there's always going to be more rings to come and more rings to come and more growth to come. And we're going to grow in ways that we can't imagine are going to come up in 100 years or 1,000 or 10,000. So what we do right now is we acknowledge the fact that we are in the middle of a significant shift, which is different than anything that has happened in the last 2,000 years. And it is a conversation that will require that we roll up our sleeves and take a good hard look at these different outcomes and why one hermeneutic is going to take us further and beyond, and why the other hermeneutic has seen its day. And we should expect from it that it will slowly continue to fade away as all the previous ones have. And that's okay too, because everybody's got, I'm going to fade away at some point. Everybody and everything has a role and function for its time. So anyway, that's my diagrams, that's sacred geometry. Again, I'm just dipping my toe into it. I'm throwing a few things out there. I could have done numerology. Numerology is another big deal. And we who are of presence and have been around presence for a long, long time know all about how the numerology works. If you're in that left-hand circle, you could be Noah. And the transformative period in the middle is 40 days and 40 nights of the flood. And then you come out and a new world begins. If you're in Israel, you're on the left-hand circle. The beginning of your journey is a wilderness wandering in the middle, and that wilderness wandering is 40 years. And then you come out into a promised land. If we go to the time of Christ, the time of Christ is the cross begins a period that goes about 40 years till the temple falls, and there is a transformation of the ages, a transformative process. And back to birth pains, and this being a symbol of birthing. How long is a pregnancy? A doctor will say, oh, a pregnancy is 40 weeks. So whether it's 40 days and 40 nights, 40 weeks, 40 years, we can see that numerology is also amazingly coincidental to transform, the transformation of all things. So that's enough for today. I appreciate your time, appreciate your attention. I'm going to leave it here, and we will pick it up next week on Future of Faith and have a good discussion at that time. So I'm going to sign off for now. Hope you guys have a great week, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. See you next time.